So Baroness Helena Kennedy is a leading legal expert and barrister in human rights law and civil liberties, and on the constitutional issues. She's a member of the House of Lords and chair of Institute of International Commission of Jurists, and she is the one who is pushing for Magnitsky laws in the UK. She's the one who pushed for Magnitsky acts in the UK, but also leading figure in the global movement of Magnitsky laws. So without further ado, if I could invite you, Baroness Kennedy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a real privilege to be joining you and all my legal colleagues and parliamentary colleagues in Japan, and also to embrace those who are in the academic community, because they too have important voices when it comes to the development of law. I'm going to pay, first of all, a tribute to Bill Browder, who has been the real mover and shaker in creating Magnitsky law, really in honor of the man who was his lawyer, who was undoubtedly murdered in Russia for representing someone who the Russian authorities and probably the president himself had decided was an enemy of the state. And so in order to honor him and to seek some kind of justice for him, Bill Browder has really been an instrument of enormous change in our world. And I hope that the world recognizes the importance of what he has done. He's been relentless in going from government to government, making the case for why we have to give teeth to international law. And I just want to say why it's so important. One of the things that we should all remember is that when the International Court of Justice was created, and it was designated as the court in which any sorts of disagreements or conflicts between nations could be resolved, from matters to do with territorial, who owns which bit of territory and which bit of land, to all manner of things. But there were certain issues where some nations created reservations. And indeed, the United States has a reservation in relation to, for example, genocide and certain other human rights matters. But the nations of the world have signed up to that. China too has a reservation, for example, in the International Court of Justice in dealing with matters usually of a human rights nature, but genocide, for example, is one of them. And so the court is closed off for the resolution of some of the major conflicts in our world. And so then, of course, we have the International Criminal Court, which is a court which was to deal with individuals who commit serious human rights crimes. And unfortunately, some of the major nations of the world have not signed up to the International Criminal Court. And so seeking justice for some of the most grievous of crimes in our world is particularly difficult. And so repeatedly, we've had to say there is no way of creating proper solutions or ways of calling to account those responsible for grievous crimes. And what the Magnitsky regime does, and to his great credit, Bill Browder, and then others. I mean, people like myself, and Irwin Cotler is one of my great heroes too, who has been such a champion of human rights in our world. We've all had to decide that there has to be a way of getting some kind of resolution for these injustices. And by giving teeth to international law, we can do at least something. And that is about going after the individuals who are responsible for these crimes, go after their assets, go after prevent them having visas so they can't travel, and take their vacations in nice places, or buy houses in London or in Kyoto or in Manhattan, and salt away their assets in other places. And we can actually make life at least in some way, less comfortable for the powerful and the abusers of human rights, who usually are the most powerful in these societies. On the 6th of July, 2020, last year, the UK introduced a global human rights sanctions regime. And it went through our parliament. And as you mentioned, Madam Chair, as well as being a lawyer of many decades experience now, I'm also a person who sits in the House of Lords, which is part of our legislature in the United Kingdom. And so we introduced the regime, and it was basically focusing on conduct which amounts to serious violations by a state of, for example, the right to life, the right not to be tortured or exposed to inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, and the right to be free from slavery and not to be held in servitude and not to be required to perform forced labor. So far, the United Kingdom has created sanctions against 80 individuals across 10 countries. The first and foremost, of course, was to, in recognition of the whole business of Magnitsky sanctions, was to turn to Russia. And 25 Russians are on our list, arising out of the horrible death of a lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, doing his duty as a lawyer representing his client, but who ended up having false claims made against him, being thrown in prison, being tortured, and not given medical treatment, and left to die. And the Russians who are on that list are people who were involved in the prison system, the courtroom system, and other senior officials. 6 Russians are also on the list for the recent poisoning of Alexei Navalny. And we pressed for those people to be added to the list. We also have 20 Saudi nationals on our list in relation to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was murdered in an extrajudicial killing. Now the United States has released the intelligence report and indicated that their view is that the directions for this crime came from the very top within the royal family, and that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, was the person who gave that order. I myself was involved in going to Turkey with the rapporteur for extrajudicial killing, who has a mandate to look into grievous acts of the kind that were being alleged by Turkey. And we went, I went because of my experience as a criminal lawyer. I was part of, she asked me to be part of her investigative team. We went with a very senior police officer and a pathologist, and we heard the intelligence. I heard the truly horrible tapes of his killing and dismemberment, but I also heard the conversations which preceded it, which showed the depth of the planning and the discussions that there were with the pathologist and the senior intelligence officer present at the consulate, discussing the difficulties there would be in dismembering him in the actual consulate. So there was no question but that this was a planned, orchestrated assassination of someone who was a critic of the regime in Saudi Arabia, and who was seen as someone who had to be disposed of, rather like a mafia operation. These were highly skilled intelligence officers and highly skilled operatives who came and conducted that crime. And so 20 Saudi nationals are on that list, including an intelligence officer who was one of the closest royal advisors. 2 high-ranking Myanmar generals, Min and So Win, are now on the list. 2 organizations in North Korea associated with the gulags there are also on the list. There are 4 Zimbabwean chiefs on the list. There are 10 politicians from a range of countries, Gambia, Pakistan, Venezuela, and indeed some other Russian officials involved with crimes other than Navalny and Magnitsky. We have 8 Belarusians now on the list, including Alexander Lukashenko, who's one of the, a Stalinist leader there, and his son Victor is also on the list. We have suspended trade now with Myanmar as the situation there has got worse. So as you see, this now is a way in which we deal with some of the terrible crimes that are happening in our world. One of the things that Irwin Cotler and myself are involved in is we both sit on a coalition, an inter-parliamentary coalition on China, which includes parliamentarians from across Europe, from Canada, from the United States of America, from Australia, from Japan, and there are usually two co-chairs. And I'm one of the co-chairs from the United Kingdom, and we again are looking at what China is doing, particularly in relation to the Uyghurs, but also in relation to Hong Kong, and in relation to the Uyghurs, we have been really concerned. Seeking ways of dealing with an ongoing genocide. And let me just deal with the problems that we have on that. Our Parliament says that they will not determine whether a genocide is in progress. The Genocide Convention says we have to stop genocides, not wait until they're over, but to actually seek to prevent them. But our Parliament says that it's not for Parliament to decide whether such a thing is in progress and to examine evidence to that effect. The proper place for that is in a court of law. And of course, they're referring to the International Court of Justice. But China has a reservation, and so it's not going to be brought there, and they will exercise their reservation. And nor can the International Criminal Court be used against individuals because China didn't sign up to the International Criminal Court. So what do? We've given impunity to certain people. And so what one would want to do is to find ways of addressing what is an ongoing genocide, certainly in my view. And again, unfortunately, our country has not yet used targeted sanctions against individuals in China, whereas the United States most certainly has. The United States has already placed on the list, for example, the governor of the Xinjiang province, the place where these terrible crimes are taking place. Now, I want to talk about the other area of work where Irwin Cotler and myself are engaged together, and he's a great mentor to all of us. I'm the director of the International Bar Association's Institute of Human Rights. And one of the things that we have been engaged in recently over the last 2 years is our concerns about media freedom in our world. We have seen a huge increase in the assassination of journalists. One of the things that authoritarian leaders don't like is that they don't like a free media, they don't like criticism, they don't like exposure of corruption at high level, and they don't like the exposure of their misconduct. And so they go after journalists. And we have seen the most incredible things, not just the murder of Khashoggi, but of many journalists around the world. And we always expect those terrible things to happen in conflict zones, but we're finding that it's not conflict zones that are the major places where journalists are killed. They are actually being assassinated. And so great concerns about the media freedom. We're also concerned about misinformation, disinformation, but all the ways in which things are closed down. But particularly the horrors of what's happening to journalists the world over. Huge increase in those murders. And so we are working, Canada and the United Kingdom came together to create a global project. And now 40 countries have pledged to, made a commitment to protect media freedom in their nations and globally. And we have been creating a set of legal opportunities and recommendations to nations as to how you could change your law or how you can actually address some of the things that are happening in other countries. The first report came out of this project, which is run by the Institute of Human Rights at the International Bar Association. One of the first report, it was the first report, was a targeted sanctions report saying we have to go after those who are behind the killings of journalists. We have to use them in this particular area. So when, Madam Chair, you asked the question of Irwin Cotler about who should we be particularly concerned about, obviously, we must have real concern about human rights lawyers. We must have concern about activists for protection of human rights of citizens in nations around the world, but also we have to be concerned about journalists. And so the high-level panel that has been put together has created a number of reports, and I would encourage people to have a look at our website, which is under the IDA's rubric. The United States was the first adopter of the Magnitsky legislation, and they have already used 3,000 targeted sanctions, and sometimes against judges and prosecutors, but also non-state actors like businessmen. And they have included, unlike ourselves, they have included abuses of media professionals. One of the concerns we have is that our list, our designations as to what is included in the targeted sanctions for crimes, is that we haven't included arbitrary detentions. And arbitrary detentions are one of the things used against journalists. You only have to look at Turkey, where huge numbers of journalists have just been thrown in jail. And so we have to look at places where that happens, where journalists are arrested and a long time passes before crimes are alleged against them, and often they're just trumped up charges. And we are putting together reports on what those charges are and how we should address them. But the United States, for example, has included Assad and his officials. They've included judges from Venezuela, and they have placed the Minister of Justice and the Minister of the Interior in Turkey onto their list because of what's been happening in Turkey. Now, we should really be looking at what's happening in relation to China, and we should be putting senior Chinese officials onto our lists. We also should be doing the same in relation to Iran. The United States has got 2 Iranian judges on their lists, and we should be looking closely at some of the judges who are doing most terrible things to people there too. So we're now trying to encourage other nations to join in this. The European Union has now embraced the Magnitsky sanctions regime. We would like to see Japan coming on board. Australia is in the process of considering this shift and using targeted sanctions as well. And South Korea is also having discussions at high level amongst its politicians, its lawyers, its judiciary about the use of targeted sanctions. And in Latin America, Panama and the Bahamas are having conversations about changing their laws to include targeted sanctions. So Magnitsky law is a vital tool in the securing of justice in an unjust world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Kennedy. That was a powerful statement to highlight the importance of Magnitsky law. Before going to questions, I see that Zara and Perry has put links to the reports that you mentioned. So for the participants, if you're interested, please find the reports from there. There is a question about the process of listing those people on Magnitsky list. And one of the participants asked, how can civil society be involved in listing individuals on the list? And is there any limitations? What type of information should they give? And is there any limitations to, is there any challenges in that regard?
Well, usually civil society organizations inside society are the very lobbyists who can put pressure on governments to include certain people in the sanctions lists. We've just had in the last 24 hours the Netherlands announcing that they are going to deal with Myanmar. The European Union is including now people from, they're putting people from China on their lists, and Eritrea, Libya, North Korea, Russia, and South Sudan. So that they really are actively responding to the pressures of the different groupings within Europe and within the different nations of Europe, where they have special connection and special knowledge of what's going on inside countries. And also there's the process of having to identify those who are the decision makers in many of these situations. But undoubtedly, groups, NGOs, have an important role in informing government as to how the sanctions regime should be used.
There's another question from the participant about any reasons why government of your country decided to pass Magnitsky legislation. What is the specific reason why your government decided to pass this legislation, and is it signaling a stronger stance against acts of corruption and human rights violations?
I do believe that a lot has happened in the United Kingdom over the last 20 years. We ourselves incorporated the European Convention of Human Rights into English law. And we've always rather proudly sort of different from the rest of Europe in the nature of our legal system. But once we had incorporated the European Convention of Human Rights into English law, it created a sort of an intellectual shift about regarding the seriousness of human rights, and a sort of much greater understanding of what human rights means in terms of protecting individuals within nations, and how human becomes a vocabulary which crosses our borders, a language for the world about values and about what matters and about responding to inhumanity. And I think that raised our bar in terms of understanding why human rights regimes were important and why we had to live by those values in our foreign policy too. It did make a difference that we've had a number of foreign ministers who've said that human rights must be at the heart of foreign policy. And that happened certainly during the new Labour regime, where the foreign ministries made it very clear that human rights would inform how they made decisions about international relations. And Dominic Raab, our current foreign minister, Foreign Secretary, is an international lawyer. He trained as a lawyer. He spent time at The Hague, and he is very familiar with the grievous nature of certain crimes, and he made a commitment. I think, and he's someone who spent time with Bill Browder and got to understand how this regime could work. And so having him in place has been a great help in creating this sanctions regime inside the United Kingdom.
Okay, I see two questions that I can combine together. So do you think UK is a strong human rights advocate in the world, and do you see a danger of having a so-called civilized countries as one bloc and to seek human rights? And another question from another person was about how do you make sure that national interest is not considered over human rights considerations?
Irwin Cotler has spoken about the difficulties that always confront a government about their relations with other countries, particularly about trading relations, about the economic interests of a nation, and about the risk of damaging important connections which maintain the financial stability of a country. So there's no doubt that there are balancing acts which have to be taken into account in settling on who you sanction. It's like the United States at this moment choosing not to sanction Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. He himself is not on the list. And I'm sure that that's partly because the United States is very committed to ending the war in Yemen and the terrible humanitarian crisis that's happening there, with women and children and dying, with a food problem, getting nutrition and food to the citizens there. And so they want that humanitarian crisis to be dealt with, and they know that they need to be in close connection with the Saudi royal family to enable that. So they've held back on that final business of whether to sanction bin Salman. And you can understand why nations have to make those careful decisions. We in the United Kingdom are having this problem over the business of China, because we have good trading relations with China, and we undoubtedly want to maintain them. But we also want to maintain good relations for diplomatic reasons, which relate to Hong Kong, because we have a special responsibility with regard to Hong Kong, a place which we had colonized and where we had responsibility for many years. And so the people of Hong Kong are reliant on our voice with regard to China. So these things are very subtle and careful, and they are nuanced. So let's not pretend that they aren't. They're difficult. But to have at your hand something that can be used is also a way of bringing the other side to the table on some of the challenging issues that confront foreign ministries. And so that's why we would urge Japan to join in having this additional tool, because there's nothing more that concentrates the mind more than knowing that there could be consequences for senior people, their ability to travel, etc. So it becomes important, and I think people might think twice about some of the activities in which they engage if they know that this regime is available to sanction them. So it's very difficult and it's very important, and making those decisions fall to the hands of experienced politicians. But having it as a tool is undoubtedly very important. And can I just mention, no nation has completely clean hands. And the question about, is it the good countries versus the bad countries? But none of us are totally good. Look at the issue of race in the United States. That has been a running sore since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created. Jim Crow laws existed at that time. And look at my own country, where only recently we had to make a decision that we wouldn't detain people without trial after 9/11 and over the issue of international terrorism. And so, our courts resolved that, but there was a period where human rights activists and human rights lawyers were criticizing government over a breach of human rights. It was a breach of human rights, and our Supreme Court decided that it was a breach of human rights. So all of our countries fall from grace from time to time. None of us can pat ourselves on the back and say that we're perfect, but this is a regime that can be used for those who are committing the most grievous of crimes and committing them over a period of time.